Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Tinus. I'm one of the principal consultants at MWR, and today I would like to talk to you about basically what has been our journey that we've gone on to prepare for a cyber incident. So maybe just a little bit of background, but in today's time, unfortunately, cyber incidents are a part of life. It's no longer the question about if you are going to suffer a breach, it's more a question about when and how frequent. And essentially, some of the issues that we're seeing out there is that these attacks are becoming more common, and the skill level required by your threat actors have significantly decreased. With new offensive tooling that has came out, essentially it is incredibly easy for those type of attacks to be staged by threat actors, which means that their skill level has decreased. And unfortunately, from the blue team side of things, we can't say the same. Your blue team has to defend against any possible attack out there, while your red team only needs one of those attacks to succeed. So to deal with a cyber incident effectively, what needs to happen is we need to make sure that we prepare. And that is where tabletop exercises come into play. That's annoying. So essentially a tabletop exercise is, I like to call it a good Dungeons and Dragons session for your blue team, but instead of dragons, we have some ransomware. And the idea behind it is that we'll sit around the table and we'll have a discussion about what we would do during a typical cyber incident. We usually choose a specific scenario, and then we run the team through that scenario and we test the processes and what is the team going to perform based on the information that they have available on the table. And this really allows the team to exercise those processes, identify potential gaps that may exist in those processes, and start to remediate those ones to prepare for when there will be a live incident. There is, however, a couple of known shortcomings when we talk about tabletop exercises. And one of the biggest ones that we have there is the fact that talking about an incident and talking about a specific action is really not the same as actually performing that action. There's a lot of intricacies involved when we actually need to perform the actions or need to take containment, eradication, and recovery measures against an attacker. It's easy for us to have a discussion and say, we'll switch off the bank, or we'll cut the internet line. But that is actually, number one, an incredibly costly thing to perform. And secondly, a lot of the times it's easier said than actually implemented as an action. Who do you call to switch off the internet of your entire organization? So often another issue that we see with these type of things is that it doesn't really simulate the full attacker's approach. There's quite a lot of discrepancies there. And the reason for it is that we see that blue teams have a lot of experience in the initial phases of the cyber kill chain. That's unfortunately where the blue team gets the most experience, is in dealing with attacks when they are still in the infancy stages of the cyber kill chain. Blue teams have become significantly better at dealing at things such as a phishing attack, but it often leaves out those later phases of the cyber kill chain, such as lateral movement and goal execution, such as the deployment of ransomware. And then my other sort of pet peeve that I have with these type of tabletop exercises is that the countermeasures that are deployed are often hyperinflated. So my favorite is the basically golden vulnerability scanner that just detects every single vulnerability out there, or the AV scan that just finds the malware and kills it before anything can happen based off it. That's not actually the case. I can tell you that from experience, that those type of countermeasures are not as effective as we think that they are. So taking those shortcomings into consideration, we start this journey with a request from a client. Basically what the client requested from us is they wanted us to help them to make these exercises a lot more engaging and a lot more believable. They wanted these exercises, these tabletop exercises, to be more in line with real-world attacks and what we are seeing out there when it is an actual incident. The other thing that they wanted us to try and solve is usually what you have during these tabletop exercises is that your incident management team will almost run ahead of your incident response team because they can simply ask a question and miraculously the investigation that your incident response team would have been performing to get them the information required to take the appropriate actions would just be available. So there were discrepancies where the incident response team were almost left behind because all of the information in a tabletop exercise is available with simply asking a question. And then lastly, what the team also wanted us to do is to see how it would be possible for us to effectively assess the team's capabilities, which is an incredibly hard thing to do during tabletop exercises, given the fact that the scenario is ever changing every single time you run those exercises. So are you truly testing the team's capabilities for a specific scenario, or their holistic and overall abilities that are required to deal with an incident should something happen? So it's with this request that we started our journey. And what happened was we decided that, look, based on the client request that we got in, there's a couple of challenges that we need to solve. And the journey started with looking for potential solutions for these challenges. Now, the first challenge that we had was a technical challenge. We needed some way to make these type of tabletop exercises more believable. And in order to facilitate that, we needed to create a lab, an environment where we could simulate an organization. And our thought process behind that was, if we have a fictitious organization, we will be able to simulate live attacks using the red team experience that we have gathered over the last couple of years, and then basically capture log information as those attacks are happening that can be replayed for the team. So to create our lab environment, we decided to make use of Vagrant, and we created a representation of a fictitious organization that had a demilitarized zone with web applications, a mail server, and we also had an entire corporate network that we hosted, including domain controllers, workstations, and servers. The idea behind this was to create an environment that was a small representation of what you can expect to find in organizations out there. And then what we would do is on each of these hosts, we would install log capturing software that will allow us to essentially capture logs as the live attack was happening. To stage the live attack, what we did is we basically took our years of red teaming experience and we built together an attack that spanned across the entire cyber kill chain. So if we look at, for example, our first scenario that we executed in this lab environment, it started with reconnaissance on the perimeter by performing mass scanning and footprinting of what's available there. Those typical reconnaissance type of actions that you would see that a threat actor would perform before attacking an organization. Those mass scans led to the threat actor understanding that there's a vulnerability on one of the web applications, and they were able to breach that application and exfiltrate sensitive customer data from the application. And while already gaining access to the application, they had the ability to deploy persistence to the web application host and start enumeration of the internal network. Using a cyclic approach of lateral movement, privilege escalation, pivoting, and re-enumeration, the threat actor was able to compromise the entire Active Directory domain, from where they were able to start with goal execution, which in this case was recovering the keys to the kingdom. So the Swift administrator was compromised, and the credentials of that user was recovered to essentially facilitate a payment. And then to cover the tracks, there was some log removal as well as the deployment of distributed ransomware to make it harder for the blue team to essentially see the actions that were performed. Using this scenario, we basically split each of those elements into what we called small mini threat modules. And the idea was that we would execute a threat module, capture the logs that were created based on that threat module, and then what we would do is, after the fact, we could take all of those mini threat modules and splice their times together to create one log format that would span the entire cyber kill chain. Now, the reason we decided to use those mini modules was we wanted the ability to interchangeably change the specific components that we had in the attack that was simulated. So what we could then do is, after splicing those logs together, we had one log source that we could replay to the team on the day of their tabletop exercise and have the blue team hunt through the log information to review it and try to find indicators of compromise and tactics, techniques, and procedures that the threat actors used. With the technical challenge solved, the next challenge that we had was a communication challenge. Communication is an absolute vital component during any tabletop exercise and real-life incident. And the reason for that is that your teams need to effectively communicate for them to understand the scope of the incident and take the appropriate actions against the threat actor through containment, eradication, and recovery. Now, in order for us to assess the team's capabilities, we needed a method through which we would be able to intercept the communication that was happening during the tabletop exercise and assess that communication. Now, for that reason, we decided to host Zulip, an instant messaging platform, and essentially create a bunch of different channels on Zulip that could be used by the team for specific communication that had to be sent. This also solved the second problem for us, which was that talking about an action is not the same as taking an actual action. So what we wanted the teams to do is we had channels such as the IT support ticket channel, which could be used by the team to log a support ticket to take a specific action. And we, as the facilitators, would then perform that action for the team. So the nice thing about this was, even though the team might have some wonderful and colorful discussions about the type of actions that they want to take, if no one logged the ticket for the action, we considered that action to not be taken. And it actually happened a couple of times where the teams really had discussed the right type of actions to take, but with no one taking accountability of actually logging the ticket, taking accountability for the action, it never actually realized. So with the communication challenge being solved, the last challenge that we had was the assessment challenge. And it brings us back to the question of how can you effectively assess a team's capabilities if the scenario is different every single time you run these exercises. And what we realized is to solve this challenge, we had to abstract the assessment criteria that we were using from the specific scenario at hand. And what we had to do is tie that assessment back to a known incident management framework. Now, in our case, we decided to basically include the NIST cybersecurity framework. And what we could do from this incident management framework is we had questions that were specifically asked for each of the phases that should be happening from an incident management perspective during the incident that we played out during the tabletop. Now, that in itself already allowed us to assess the team's capabilities in each of the specific phases of the framework, but it still did not solve the problem, that is, how do we keep the scenario out of this? And what we realize is that it's essentially how we phrase the questions that we ask in that assessment. So rather than, for example, asking, did the team isolate the workstation, which is a very specific action that should be taken if the scenario warrants it with a workstation being compromised, we could rather ask the question, was the team's containment procedures adequate? Because what is adequate depends on the scenario, but whether the team is able to find those adequate or appropriate actions is another question. And that question can be asked for every single one of these exercises that we do, irregardless of the scenario. Another example is, did the team send a summary report to the CEO, which would only happen if the CEO in that specific incident requested a summary report. We can rather ask the question, did the team ensure to keep all relevant stakeholders updated, right? Which again, that is scenario independent. And then lastly, did the team perform a domain takeback, which again, very specific question if Active Directory has been breached. We can rather ask, would the team's response be sufficient to flush the attackers from the estate? Did the team perform the adequate or accurate eradication actions given the specific scenario? So now all of a sudden, these questions are scenario independent. So using all of this, we felt that we have solved the biggest challenges that we need, and it was now time to run the gauntlet and actually see whether the solution that we had on the table would solve this challenge. So essentially what we did is we ran iterations with our tabletop exercises. We would perform several of these exercises against various different clients and their different opcos and gain new insights from each of those exercises that we were executing. The idea was then during a full iteration of running all of these exercises, we would gather those insights, make improvements to the solution that we have, and then again run another iteration and learn new things. So it's worthwhile to note that this is still work in progress and it's nowhere near perfect. However, we do believe that we are making a step in the right direction to making these exercises more interactive, assessing the teams accurately, and helping them to better align and communicate during a cyber incident. So let's take a look at some of these iterations. So for iteration 1, it was really our most stressful one. This was the first time we were going to use our new solution that we have created. So we did stress a bit. However, based on some of the improvements that we made here, as I mentioned, we did believe that we created a more realistic tabletop exercise that truly mimicked the cyber kill chain and would allow the team to perform an effective incident response. We also believe that what we have created allowed for more active participation from the incident response team so that the incident management team was not running away from them during the exercise. And we also believe that we created a system that would allow us to assess the team's capabilities irrespective of the specific scenario that we have. After running quite a big number of these exercises, during iteration 1, we learned a couple of new insights from these incidents. The first thing that we realized is that a lot of the blue teams out there have a significantly larger amount of experience with the initial phases of the cyber kill chain. If it's a phishing attack, if it's someone scanning a perimeter, all of those type of actions the team can easily detect and essentially take the appropriate actions to stop the attack at that point. The issue is with that 1% of the attacks that slips through the cracks, that makes it later into the cyber kill chain. Those were the incidents where the team really had some issues to take the appropriate actions. Visibility reduced. The team were more uncertain about the scope and did not know what was the appropriate containment, eradication, and recovery actions to take. Another insight that we learned is that the eradication part in containment, eradication, and recovery was missing from a lot of the processes that were used by the teams. So the team would go incredibly hard, contain the incident, made sure that the attacker could not spread further, and then do a rebuild. And without understanding how the attacker got initial access, without understanding what led to that compromise and eradicating that path that was available, the attacker would simply just get access again once the rebuild has been completed. So we realized that eradication is such a vital component to take before moving on to recovery. We also learned that for a lot of the teams, there were very wonderful discussions that were held. But without that one key leader that said, right, that was a good discussion, team. Based on that discussion, we are going to implement the following actions. It often led to inaction. So unfortunately, during an incident, while democracy can be used to gather insights and to gather ideas that can be taken, you do need a little bit of that autocracy with someone actually taking charge and saying, right, this is what we are going to do. We also learned that the teams really need to rely a little bit more on their subject matter experts. I think that often we expect that our blue teams are sort of the experts in everything, and that is simply not the case. If a web application is compromised, rather than the blue team trying to figure out what's the data that was compromised, what does the application do, a much simpler approach would be to involve the product owner or the developers of that application. See them as the subject matter experts for that application and essentially recover data from them that helps the team to understand the scope of the incident, which will again lead to more appropriate actions that can be taken. And then from our side, we definitely learned that open questions really do not work in a questionnaire, especially if you have more than 100 questions in your assessment form that needs to be answered. Open questions is not the way to go. So very quickly into iteration 1, we actually changed that to close-ended questions and streamlined the assessment criteria that we had. This led us to iteration number 2. So taking all of those insights, we decided to make the following improvements for our second iteration. The first thing, as I mentioned before, was that we made the assessment criteria simpler and made sure to make use of close-ended questions which could be answered faster by the facilitators while running a tabletop exercise. We also decided that we wanted to give the team the best opportunity to succeed, so we actually integrated the client sim solution into the tabletop exercise, since this was the solution that they were more familiar with and able to deal with the incident on a little bit more of a familiar territory. We then also decided that it was time for us to introduce some new modern attacker techniques such as supply chain attacks. And our reasoning behind this is that the attackers out there are constantly upskilling. There's constantly new different techniques that are being published as to how systems can be compromised, can be breached, and we need to make sure that the blue teams that are defending against these know of these type of attacks and know how to adequately respond to them. We also decided that we wanted to host a larger environment, so we effectively doubled the size of this fictitious organization that we had, and we hosted multiple new additional services such as GitLab for CI/CD pipelines and even jump hosts into the environment from other regions as well. Now, running iteration number 2, which again, we ran these tabletop exercises against multiple different blue teams, we gathered the following insights. The first thing that we realized is that the playbooks of those type of teams were not adequately catering for modern attacks. When an application breach happened, the CI/CD pipeline, the software development lifecycle, was not necessarily taken into consideration. And if a compromise did not happen or happened indirectly on the web application, those teams would essentially struggle to deal with it and understand the scope of the attack. We also realized that one of the issues that happened was that the proper handling of forensic evidence was often forgotten. So a team would do containment and then let's delete that, or let's do a complete rebuild without taking into consideration the forensic evidence that would truly be needed to go back after sort of the incident and truly try to understand the path that the attackers took. We then also realized that while note-taking is hard, it was incredibly vital for incident management. The teams that performed the best were the teams that did not only take notes about the actions that they took against the attackers, but essentially also the effect that those actions had. Were the actions effective? Because if they were not, those were the teams that would then essentially take containment, eradication, and recovery in a cyclic process of making sure to recontain, re-eradicate, and then perform recovery to verify that those actions were successful. And we also realized that understanding the incident scope is incredibly vital to take the correct actions. If you don't understand the scope of the incident that you're dealing with, it will lead to you either overreacting or, in an even worse case, underreacting and not being able to effectively remove the attacker from the environment. So it's vital to understand the incident scope, which goes back to that knowledge and learning about modern attacker techniques that's so incredibly vital for the blue teams out there. And then from our side, this was the very first time that we were able to actually pull results from our criteria, because we now had 2 different iterations for every single one of the teams that we could compare. And our criteria did work to show us the areas where the teams improved, where improvements were not yet sufficient, and in some areas where the team took a little bit of a step backwards. Our criteria was able to show those different areas. And then the last sort of thing that we learned is that increasing the environment size did not really actually contribute to the overall success of the incident that we were running. And it's simply because it's already so jam-packed of action for 4 hours, that it truly doesn't make a difference how many hosts you have there. It's more about the detail of the scenario that you inject into the host that you have available for the scenario. So with that being said, we started to make improvements for iteration number 3. And the first thing that we did is we made sure to again reduce our environment size. Since it was not actually helping us, and since it was not actually contributing to the overall success of the exercise, we could go back to a smaller environment. We then also decided that this year we wanted to run those attacks in a live estate. We didn't want to run the attack and then after the fact replay those logs for the team. So what we decided to do is to host that live environment and then actually introduce a endpoint detection and response tool and an additional SIM through MD-ATP. And what we would then do is basically focus on modern attacker techniques and do a live execution of the scenario on the day that we were running these exercises. So this would allow us a couple of things. Firstly, we could provide a team with live access to the environment to truly test the type of actions that they want to take. If they want to isolate a host, we can isolate that host. If they want to drop the internet line, we can drop the internet line to that lab environment. But then secondly, what it also allowed is for us to react a little bit more like a typical threat actor would. So if the team closed down one path, what we could do is essentially take another path to try and compromise or achieve the scenario that we planned ahead. And then, as I mentioned before as well, we refocused on modern attacker techniques. Since it is such a vital component for teams to take new information of the type of offensive tooling that's out there, of the type of new attacks that these threat actors are performing, we refocused on these modern attacker techniques and made sure to incorporate them in the scenario as well. And this is essentially where we are currently at. We have just finished running iteration 3, and we are still processing the results thereof to find the improvements and the insights that we need to make for the next iteration. But a couple of key takeaways. The first thing that we realized is that a cyber incident response capabilities definitely needs to be tested independent of the scenario. We can't just focus on specific scenarios, but we need to make sure that the processes and how the team is going to collaborate during an incident will work irregardless of the scenario at hand. We realize that incident scope is incredibly important during dealing with a cyber incident, because if we don't understand the scope, we will not be able to take the appropriate containment, eradication, and recovery actions. We also realize that playbooks definitely need to be updated for more modern attacker techniques. I mean, who here has updated your incident playbooks with Active Directory breaches to deal with certificate templates? Your Active Directory playbook is probably telling you to reset a password of an account, and while that's definitely a good action, if persistence is deployed through a certificate, a password reset is not really going to fix anything. That's a modern attacker technique that now needs to be incorporated in these type of playbooks and make sure that we are aware of them, we verify whether there's persistence through those mechanisms, and then take the appropriate actions to recover Active Directory should that have happened. And we also realize that these tabletop exercises can be made more interactive, and it will allow your incident response team to collaborate more with your incident management team during these type of exercises. Now, for that last point, we can help a little bit by essentially releasing a collection of the scripts that we use to create this lab environment that we ourselves are hosting for these exercises. So this will allow teams to create their own lab environment, which they can then use to simulate an attack and run a tabletop exercise where there's essentially a live team that is attacking the organization. Now, as I mentioned, this is definitely a journey for us, and our journey is nowhere near complete. And in the future, what we want to do is we want to increase sort of this lab environment, and not necessarily in size, but capability to allow us to run even more modern attacker techniques and truly understand what are those edge cases where visibility gets reduced because log information is simply not there. or in cases where we need to update our playbooks to deal with an incident that has those modern attacker techniques. What we also want to do is, as I mentioned, those modern attacker techniques, but then with certain mature clients that already sort of have the incident management and incident response process down for early in the cyber kill chain, we want to run what we call later phase simulations. So those are for organizations that have the basics down. And what we then do is we just completely ignore the initial part of the cyber kill chain. And we say, well, let's assume breach. Let's assume that a threat actor was able to get access to an organization and they are busy performing goal execution. What we then do is we test the team's response capabilities right at those later phases during the cyber kill chain. So what we have done in the past as well is essentially create what we call safe ransomware that can mimic the behavior of ransomware and allow us to execute that across a organization's estate to truly test the response team's capabilities during the last couple of phases when a threat actor is getting to goal execution. And that is it. Any questions?